The birds stopped chirping. The leaves in the trees stopped rustling.
I recently moved to South Dakota for work, and last week my co-workers and I decided to drive down to Badlands National Park in an attempt to catch the Aurora Borealis. It didn't end up showing up, unfortunately. We arrived around 8 p.m. and stayed until 1 a.m., so it was pitch black the entire time we were there. Everything was fine until 4 of us decided to take one of our cars to look at a herd of bison that usually hung out several miles down the road. We didn't end up finding any, save for a couple of stray bulls, but that's besides the point. We ended up turning around to rejoin the others, and on the way back we saw something strange. Well, more accurately, everyone else but me saw it. This is a recurring theme, and part of the reason I hesitated to share this story. However, while I cannot back it up myself, multiple people saw the same thing at different times, without discussing it with each other, and their reactions seemed genuine. As we sped over the hill, the other 3 people in the car with me started freaking out. They started asking each other whether anyone else saw what they saw, and verifying exactly what it was they spotted. They all agreed. A tall, pale pink humanoid figure had sprinted across the road in front of us, almost too fast to see. I was skeptical, and if this had been the only sighting, I would honestly have thought nothing of it. The others were still a bit freaked out though, for the entire rest of the drive. Once we'd rejoined the rest of our workmates, things seemed normal for about an hour. We were just hanging out, looking at the stars and enjoying each other's company. However, our car drove down one of the roads near us, and the person next to me stared at the car and went, "Holy shit, what's that?" She kept her gaze on it and relayed it to us. Please note, we hadn't talked about what we saw in the car once we arrived back at the campsite. She said she had seen the same figure sprinting across the street in front of the other car and had kept an eye on it in the dark. She also stated it had moved so fast it had traveled down the road in a mere few seconds. At this point, we were all thoroughly creeped out. The people who'd been in the car with me relayed our story about the figure that ran in front of our car. They agreed that they'd seen the same thing, and we all kept our eyes out for the rest of the time we were there. I do intend to head back there sometime, against my better instincts perhaps, to see if I can catch a glimpse of it myself. And I'll update this, if I ever end up doing so. I've only been living here at Snow College for a couple of months, but something strange is definitely happening here. For context, I am part Native American of the Lakota Sioux tribe, and I'm trying to reconnect with that part of my heritage as I have moved out and away from my parents. I've always believed in the existence of skinwalkers, but the events that have transpired over the past couple of months have solidified it for me. At first, the occurrences started out small, hearing footsteps, growling in the bushes, etc. But as the weeks have gone on, they have gotten to be bigger and bigger. It all came to a head Saturday night, when I get a frantic text from a good friend of mine, saying that he's messed up big time and scared shitless. Now, this friend of mine is a very imposing dude, 6'2" and around 280 pounds, and he grew up around Baltimore, so it takes a lot to scare him. So he's going through and telling me what happened and what he saw. A couple of blocks away from the main campus, they're building a new temple, and this friend loves to walk around this area at night. According to him, just past the one streetlight on this road, he could see a massive dog pacing back and forth, east to west. He described it as a dog with the posture of a bear, toned build, obviously wild, but no discernible fur on it. Like, it was completely in silhouette. So of course I do some research and see the accounts of the Sherman family on their ranch, and Gwen's description of a wolf or dog she ran into sounds eerily similar to what my friend saw. What my friend neglects to tell me until we were out there again last night is that he was whistling on his walk. As we approached the spot where he saw it the night before, sitting under the streetlight was the creature. It was exactly as he described it. Huge dog, posture of a bear, pointy ears, smoothest skin I've ever seen on a wild animal. We're both rightfully spooked, so we head back towards campus. As we're walking past the humanities building, he tells me that it was around this spot where he was seeing shadow figures. He described them as having distinct human forms and hearing what sounded like a huge animal running at him. He came across a bald eagle feather in the middle of the sidewalk. There haven't been any bald eagle sightings in Ephraim, from what I know. We hung out on campus for a while after our encounter by the temple grounds, and we were both able to come to the conclusion that there was almost like a line across campus that the sightings would stop. Against my better judgment, I'm planning on going out there again later tonight to see if I could maybe get any pictures of this thing for concrete evidence that we both saw something and that it wasn't just our nerves getting to us.
I am the town sheriff. A couple of weeks ago, I was informed by the FBI that there will be a family moving into my town that would be a part of the witness protection program. I wasn't given much detail other than I had to help check in on this family every other day or so, whether it was by driving by or texting one of the parents daily. I was told that they had some involvement with organized crime, whether it was with gangs or mafia. I'm not quite sure. I did notice on one of my early morning patrols of that family that the family had a daughter who seemed to be young and unassuming of the true horrors that the world had to offer. She was standing outside waiting for the school bus as I drove by. At this point, I had never seen her with any other children. I just assumed that she was an only child. The family was assigned to live on the more outskirts part of the town that nestled up to a thick forest that ended our town boundaries. Having grown up in this town, I had heard stories of some ancient evil living in those woods, but growing up I was always skeptical. I was friends with the game warden, and he told me other than the occasional stray pack of wolves or the drugged out homeless people that would sometimes live out there was nothing really to be afraid of. However, it did make the housing costs for those looking to buy near the forest much cheaper. Every town has that one story that never seems to die. A story much like a festering wound that once started as something small, now causing way more damage than the initial wound. A story to cause all nearby locals to reconsider entering the woods, especially at night. In the late 70s, there was that one incident in the forest that resulted in a mass killing of cult members. I was only a child at the time, but my uncle, who was on the force, told my dad. My father ended up telling me that about 13 people were eaten alive that were tied to trees out in those woods. At least that's what he told me one night laid around a campfire. Ever since then, the people in the town claim to hear screams coming from the woods at night, or even hearing their names being called. Apparently, if you follow the voices, then something is supposed to come and get you, but that's something I never did believe. Nonetheless, all the statements were something I could never verify nor confirm for myself. They were all secondhand stories that I've heard from other people. Seeing how the witness protection family had no idea about the dark history, it always seemed wrong that I couldn't technically inform them of what they were living next to. However, thankfully for them, they were taking the identity of corn farmers, and had a good bit of cornfields as a buffer between them and the forest. They weren't actually farmers, so they would have no business being out in those fields anyways. For whatever reason, the family seemed to be rather important to the FBI. I was given access to their security system that linked into my phone. It was supposed to be faster than calling 911. One day, seemingly out of the blue, the father of the family came by the station to inform me that he and his wife will be leaving town for the weekend and wanted me to keep an eye on his daughter. Seeing how he was genuinely concerned, I informed him that I was already keeping a soft patrol on his family, but I could definitely beef things up for him since that there will be no parents at the house. I think it was out of my place to ask, but I did it anyways. Have you or your family had any issues living near those woods? I know the cornfields are much closer, but do you ever hear anything at night? The father looked surprised, and he told me that he and his wife hadn't really noticed anything. And his daughter, well, she was deaf. I don't know if you know this, but the folklore of this town is that there's something in those woods next to those cornfields. They try to call out to people. If you listen to the voices, then something is supposed to come and get you. The father gave me a light and white smile. I could tell he thought less of me for believing in something as crazy as a creature calling out to you, but that was something everyone in this town believed. I just thought to get him on the same page. "Well, what kind of creature is it supposed to be?" he asked, almost mockingly. I shook my head and pulled out a pad and pen and wrote down the word, seeing that I didn't want to say it out loud. He read it and laughed even more. "Really? Okay, well, I guess I won't say it out loud then." I think the look on my face convinced him that there must have been something terrible to have happened for me not wanting to say this simple word. We chatted for a few more minutes and he left. This simple conversation nearly evaporated as I went throughout my day of normal policing. One of my deputies got very sick that week and had to call out. I had to cover his area and totally forgot to assign someone to watch over the witness protection family. I didn't realize the blunder I made until it was too late. It was nighttime and I got a strange notification on my cell phone which I'd never gotten before. It was as if someone was calling me, but when I looked down at my phone, my entire screen was red. It showed an address which I immediately knew to be the witness protection family. The security system had automatically called the father who I'd spoken to only a few days prior. He answered immediately and seemed to have gotten the same notification I did. He sounded panicked. I told him that his daughter needed to immediately hide until we got there, but as I said this, he told me that he could see on his cell phone that there was already someone inside the house. I told him to call his daughter and to tell her to run into the field next to the forest. If it was a local intruder, they would know better than to follow her so close to the forest that late at night. If it wasn't a local, then let's just hope that the cornfield provides enough cover until I get there. He agreed and hung up the phone and I sped off to their address. I was the second to the scene since their distant neighbor, who was asked by their parents to stop by, was already there. The front door was broken down and the living room area looked to be trashed with muddy footprints all over. I assumed those to be the intruders. The boot print trail led almost immediately to what looked like the girls' room. The window to the room was wide open.
So, I hope I am not putting myself in danger taking the time to be open about this. And I hope I'm doing this right. I will just start off with my own encounter and proceed to talk about the encounters of two other family members. So around 2 or 3 years ago, I first came across the idea of a Skinwalker existing. I've always been interested in the paranormal, but at the same time I didn't want to get involved. I wouldn't shut my mouth about it, talking to my friends about it and whatnot, until one day, something happened that spooked me. So my family has this property a mile or so along the Roanoke River. It covers a lot of land and is completely densely wooded. Part of my family has been there since. It is currently split between my sister and her fiancé, and on the other half is occupied by my grandparents. One day, I was there because the internet at my house had stopped working, and I had to complete online coursework because this was the time of COVID and shutdowns everywhere. I'm in the house, alone, quietly minding my work, and then I hear a scream in the distance. I can't say why, but I froze. My eyes locked, staring out the window. I've lived in the country before, and I know how noisy and weird animals could be. It freaked me out because I never really heard a scream like that before. It sounded distorted and animal-like, yet also like a human being murdered. In my mind, I knew it had to be an animal. I mean, it's the woods. Animals live there. They will eventually make weird noises. Now, before I finish this story, I want to first say I still think there is possibly a more common explanation for what occurred. I don't know what happened for sure, so I'm not going to make any certain statements. Well, 30 seconds after this scream, that sounded pretty far, I heard a male "hello" sound very close to the window I was staring out of. The way my gut churned and the sick feeling I got instantly was like none other. I felt like my breath was leaving my body. It was the tone of this hello. It was as if a friend was excited to see me, but I saw no one out there. My mind was just racing and telling me to get out. Likely chance of it being an actual person murdering people or something. I just need to get out of here and leave, so I did. I called up my family who were away at the time and told them what happened, explaining how they have either someone trespassing or something really weird is going on. They investigated when they came home and nothing was found. I decided to then respect that I don't know what is out there, and there are peoples who have been around longer than I have, and I should listen. I stopped worrying about it, and I rarely think of it. Personally, I've never had another encounter like that again. My sister and her fiance, however, have their own side of this ongoing story about this property. I'm only repeating what I managed to get out of them. Whenever I tried getting them to recount their experiences, they just stare off into the distance and seem closed off. It is obvious they truly believe what they saw was something out of the ordinary. Well, her fiance had family from New York over. They spent a few nights there, and a couple of the family members self-identify as witches. My sister told me they heard of the Skinwalker and wanted to try to call to it. Now, I'm not sure if that's even possible. I thought it was rather unwise, but not my house, not my problem. A while after the visit, my sister came to my house, and she talked to me about something she saw while driving home at night. She described a pale figure, white and faceless, on the side of the road of this property I had my experience at. She really wouldn't go much into detail because she didn't enjoy talking about it. I realized that something serious could be on that land. I advised her not to worry about it, and that weird, unexplainable things happen all the time. Until when her fiance was driving home by that land at night, he also saw it. He went into more detail and described it as a faceless, white, bright humanoid. It sort of crawled in a skipping fashion and didn't stop, straight across the road in front of the car. I opened up about this to someone who runs a museum for all things paranormal in a nearby area. She advised me to get into contact with someone who may know a Native American spiritual leader. The only person I know, though, was my late grandfather, so that is a dead end. I personally allowed myself to be at peace, though. I've been ignoring it and refusing to dwell on it until writing this post, and nothing has bothered me. I'm going tonight to stay at that house again. What makes it even creepier is that, especially when it's cold, we hear coyotes howling all the time out there. And it sort of became a peaceful thing knowing that nature is as it should be. But when the sun goes down and those woods are quiet, I can't help but imagine what could be happening beyond what I can see. I would actually love to go camping one day and spend time outdoors, but something changed in me that makes me reluctant to leave the walls of the house when I'm there. I apologize for the length of this post, but I hope you find my confusion and terror entertaining. Any input on what you think these encounters could have been would be appreciated. I genuinely hope all you say is nothing, and that this is just paranoia. All I can really speak for is my own one encounter. I bet if I were present at the other two, I could divulge more detail. Again, thanks for any input on what could have happened. Still a little confused on this one. Sorry this is going to be long because the story spans across a few days. The summer of 2015, before my 9th grade year, my parents and I went to Lake Lure, North Carolina, for a 10-day vacation. The day we got there, we went to a grocery store that was kinda in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by mountains. While my mum was buying groceries, my dad and I found a hiking trail on the other side of a parking lot and went on it. About a mile in, he got a call from my mum saying she needed help putting the food in the car, so we started heading back. I ran a little ways ahead over a hill and out of sight from my dad, coming across a tiny creek down off the side of the path. I went down to stick my hands in and watch the minnows while waiting for my dad to catch up, but soon I realized something was off. Everything was dead silent. The birds stopped chirping. The leaves in the trees stopped rustling. The creek wasn't babbling even though I could see the water splashing over stones with my own eyes. I couldn't hear my own breathing. I picked my head up, scanned the area and saw something, only about 15 feet away from me. I say something because I thought it was a cream-colored husky, but realized it was much bigger than any wolf-like dog I've ever seen. At the time, we had a German Shepherd, and whatever this was would have dwarfed her significantly. It was just standing there, looking directly at me, not moving or making any noise. I had not seen it when I went down to the creek. It's as though it had appeared out of nowhere. I don't know how long we stared at each other, but for whatever reason, to this day, I can't remember what its eyes looked like, and I was looking directly into them the entire time. An indeterminable amount of time passed, and then I finally heard something. My dad, still on the other side of the hill, calling out to make sure I was there. The thing's ears twitched in his direction, and then it just kind of huffed, turned away and took off, disappearing behind a ridge in 3 leaps. I was stunned. My dad approached me, asking what I was doing, and I told him, I think someone's dog is loose out here. He said there was no one else out here, so it might have been a stray.
What did it look like?
I described its appearance as best I could. Cream-colored, pointy ears, dense coat, fluffy tail, much bigger than our dog Maggie. The eyes, of course, I could not recall. He said it sounded like it resembled a husky, but was closer in size to a wolf. The only problem was, wolves are rarely solitary, and he was pretty sure there weren't any in our current location. Perplexed, we went on to help my mother with the groceries, and continued the drive to the little log cabin Airbnb we were staying in, having to chalk up the encounter as just weird. A few days later, my parents were going out to dinner, and I, being 14, stayed behind at the cabin to watch anime and get away from them. It was a shotgun-style cabin, meaning you could come in through the front door, take 10 strides straight ahead, and exit through the back door. Upon entering, you were in a combined living room and kitchenette, with the bedroom I was sleeping in to the left of the front door, and the master bedroom and bathroom to the right. It was a raised cabin, with stairs on the side by my bedroom leading up to the front porch that spanned the entire front of the house, ending on the right side with a railing. It also happened to be literally on the side of a mountain. The driveway was at an incline where you always had to put the emergency brake on whenever you parked. As they were heading out, I was sitting on the couch that was against the front wall of the house, the front door to my right, and a giant long window behind me that looked out onto the porch. The back door was ahead of me, slightly to the right, just outside of the kitchenette area. If it hadn't been in my line of sight, I wouldn't have realized it was left unlocked. And I noticed that while they were backing down the driveway, so of course, being a paranoid 14-year-old, really into creepypasta and top 5 ghost videos to make you piss yourself, I immediately got up and locked it. I then double-checked the other door and all windows, closing all the curtains over every window in the process as well. A few hours passed with not much happening. which was relieving for me since at this time I didn't have a phone, laptop, tablet, nothing to communicate with people except for the landline in the cabin, and nothing but knives in the kitchenette to defend myself. But it was short-lived. That relief was soon replaced by unimaginable fear as I heard rapid footsteps directly behind me, outside on the porch. They raced past me and stopped at the front door. Whatever or whoever it was sounded as if they were on all fours. It was quiet for a few seconds, and then the scratching began. It sounded exactly like when my dog Maggie wanted to be let back inside after we let her out to do her business. I found myself wanting to turn around and peek out the front window, or even go to the door, thinking maybe it was a neighbor's dog or a cute little raccoon. But for some reason, I simply could not move. And that was possibly the best decision my body made for me, as I looked to my right and I saw the handle on the front door slowly moving up and down, as if someone was testing it to see if it was unlocked. When it didn't budge, the handle started moving faster, more aggressive, as if whatever it was trying to rip it from the door. Then it stopped, and the four-legged footsteps scuttled to the far end of the porch and went quiet again. I sat there with the TV paused, not breathing, just listening, when maybe a minute passed, and 10 strides ahead of me on the back door, I couldn't look away, only thinking, thank God I closed the curtains on the back door's tiny little window. The scratching continued, then stopped, but the handle slowly turned up, then down, then up, then down again. It started furiously jiggling up and down, shaking the door in its threshold. I started panicking, wanting to call my parents or the police, and remembered I had access to a landline. A landline mounted on the wall right next to the back door. I stayed where I was, and eventually the shaking stopped. I sat there waiting, listening, anticipating a third and possibly successful attempt at a break-in. It never came. I went back to watching Sword Art Online, gross I know, trying to rationalize it as just being a really smart dog that lives on the side of the mountain and enjoys breaking into homes. Or a really dastardly band of raccoons. That made sense. By the time my parents got home, I had just about convinced myself that I was crazy and making the whole thing up, when my dad pointed out scuff marks low on the outer side of the front door. Not deep claw marks scratched into the wood, just the kind of scuffs that dogs with black nails leave on white painted surfaces. Again, exactly like my German Shepherd at the time would leave on our back door. I told them about the scratching on both doors and the doorknobs turning, kind of downplaying it for egotistical reasons at the time. My dad of course shrugged, saying it was probably just a stray dog, maybe a coyote. My mum did not let me stay or go anywhere by myself after that. When I told my partner this story, they looked up that area we stayed in and found out that area lies in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, which is a province of the much larger Appalachian Mountains. That was already creepy to me since Appalachia is one of the oldest mountain ranges on the planet and is known for having weird, unexplained events happen all the time. It only got worse when I told my coworker this story. She thinks I'm lucky to be alive since my experience sounds like what she had to deal with living just outside of a native reservation in New Mexico when she was a kid. According to her, skinwalkers were a common occurrence in her small town, especially in the graveyard behind her house. She apparently would hear the footsteps, the scratching, and the door handles shaking when she was home alone. We looked it up, and apparently North Carolina has the largest indigenous population east of the Mississippi River, so it may be possible. My coworker thinks it was a skinwalker, and that if I hadn't locked the back door, my parents would have come back to find me dismembered in the living room, or would not have found me at all. My partner thinks the wolf or wolf-like creature I saw was some sort of spirit trying to warn me about what would happen. Maybe imbue me with common sense and influence me to lock the door. I personally think there are some really sick people in the world, eager to do bad things to others.
Typically, when you go through something so traumatic and horrifying, your mind has a way to block those events to keep you from further suffering. However, I remember the events as if it was yesterday. It was a brisk October day with orange and brown leaves littering the streets and sidewalks. The temperature was a perfect chill to where you could almost see your breath. I would be going on a scout trip with my troop and some friends from school who weren't scouts but still wanted to come on the trip despite making fun of me for being in the Boy Scouts. The trip was a 10-mile hike round trip, 2 nights and 3 days. This took place back in the early 90s before the internet was on everyone's cell phone and technology took over our lives. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy the modern conveniences that technology provides, but it also took away some personal feeling from the world. Mr. Dawson was our scoutmaster. He was an old man that looked jolly but was anything but. He wore suspenders since most belts were not able to accommodate his spare tire. He had a grizzly white beard that had streaks of gray in it, and almost always wore an Indiana Jones-styled hat. He was a tough man and rather strong for both his age and appearance. Despite him being an old miser to just about anyone, he did love scouting and raising boys and turning them into men. Alongside Mr. Dawson, we had an assistant scoutmaster who was more understanding when it came to the youth. Mr. Carlson was a younger man in his late 30s who wore big old glasses and always tucked his shirt in, no matter what type of pants he was wearing. I think Mr. Carlson was an accountant of some kind, but he was always a party. We all loved him. Thankfully, having both leaders made our troop very well-rounded, with both growing experiences and also fun ones. Mr. Dawson was retired and divorced. I think he had 1 or maybe 2 children, but he never spoke of them. As unfortunate as that was, he almost always came on all the scout trips, while Mr. Carlson could only come on some of them. Mr. Carlson and his wife were members of my church, and they recently had a child. This would require Mr. Carlson to sometimes stay back and help with the baby. On this trip, however, Mr. Carlson would miss the first night, but hike up on the second day and meet up with us. Apparently, Mr. Dawson had an old friend that had a cabin somewhere, and he allowed the troop to stay there for a couple of nights. The troop, as well as myself and my school friends, were very excited. We have never been on a hike this long before. Normally, if we were lucky and none of the parents volunteered to come, Mr. Dawson would let us shoot his 9mm pistol that he would carry on his suspenders while camping. He also carried a double-barrel shotgun in the back window of his truck, but he never let us shoot it. We all met at the parking lot after school, down at the local grocery store where Mr. Dawson's old green truck sat idling. He sat inside smoking cigarettes. He was a smoker but never smoked near us. The troop trickled in over the next 15 minutes, including Mr. Carlson in his old Honda minivan. He only came for this night since we needed the extra seats to drive all the scouts up to the campgrounds. Once all the scouts arrived, we loaded all of our bags into Mr. Dawson's truck bed and divided the scouts into both vehicles. My friends and I preferred riding with Mr. Carlson. The younger scouts, as well as some of the outcasts, were subjected to Mr. Dawson's truck, where he only listened to political talk radio and talked about old war stories that were not very interesting. We caravanned both vehicles loaded to the brim with both scouts and materials to the local campgrounds on the outskirts of town. We were kind of in a hurry since we were in a race against time to get to the cabin before the darkness fell. But we had plenty of daylight if things went to plan, which in scouting, they never do. Mr. Carlson dropped us off with some of our stuff and told us that he'd be up there the next day with some peach cobbler. His peach cobbler was a hit with everyone and brought even a smile to the old grumpy Mr. Dawson. We set off to the cabin in which Mr. Dawson instructed that the two oldest scouts to guide us there, using an old map and a compass. Mr. Dawson led up the rear to make sure that none of the scouts didn't venture off the path or fall behind. The thing about Mr. Dawson is that he knew the way to the cabin. He had been there multiple times, in fact, but he wanted to give the scouts an opportunity to earn the orientation merit badge. For him to do that, he was not going to interfere unless it was getting too late or someone was hurt. Unfortunately, we had plenty of time before the sun was going to set, and the two scouts leading us were not geographically inclined. The two scouts began leading us, and the rest did not contribute anything constructive in terms of directions, but we did liven the spirits with talks of sports and jokes. Mr. Dawson remained quiet. The path at first was clearly laid out and had signs for the first bit, but the further we went into the dense forest, the more things began to blend in. We finally came to a fork in the path. There was no sign signaling which way was north, which is where the cabin was. The two scouts tried using the compass, but both paths seemed to be going either northwest or northeast. After 2 minutes of exchanging the map between the two scouts, one of them spoke up and asked Mr. Dawson for a hint. He shrugged and chuckled. "I'm not the one getting the merit badge. If you want it, you gotta get us to the cabin before it gets dark," he said in his old southern accent. The scouts ahead of us eventually picked the path to the right. We continued hiking, but this time we were less sure of where we were going. Our packs began to feel heavy, and despite the cool air, I for one was beginning to sweat. It was around this time that the noise in the forest began to have a strange eeriness to it. The birds that were still out this time of year didn't seem to favor this part of the forest. My anxiety was climbing, more so from being lost rather than the change in environment that we were now entering. The path began to take a significant incline as we ventured further in. It was at this moment that we all began to hear a very strange sound. It was distant but familiar. My mind immediately jumped to the worst-case scenario. It sounded like someone crying out in the woods. The scouts and even the leader began to slow down as we didn't know what to do. The closer we got, the more we realized that this crying was coming off the path and into the woods. We could see not too far off that there was an old decaying cabin that seemed to be the source of the noise. Normally, most people would ignore this and continue on. Too many red flags. However, this was different. We were Boy Scouts, and we were supposed to help people. The cabin was the biggest concern. If it looked normal, then we would have left, but since it looked abandoned, then we had to make sure that there wasn't someone in trouble. At this point, Mr. Dawson got involved. "I'm gonna take 4 scouts and we're gonna go investigate. The rest of you scouts stay here so we don't lose the path." We all agreed, and he picked me and 3 other scouts to come with him. The cabin was covered in moss and the wood looked old and twisted. The frame itself was slanted and looked unsafe to enter. The sound was more clear and it sounded like an infant crying. Mr. Dawson did something that I'd never seen him do before. He unholstered his pistol and walked around the cabin perimeter, calling out to anyone inside. No one answered and the crying continued. He went into the cabin and we followed. It didn't take us long to find the source of the noise, and to our shock, we realized that it was coming from an old radio that wasn't plugged in. One of the scouts turned off the radio and asked, "How is this possible?" Mr. Dawson looked around with a look of attentiveness. "We need to leave," he said. Right then the radio came on again, but this time it wasn't the crying sound. It played this eerie tune that I'd never heard before. The sound was unlike the crying, was distorted and warped, much like the rest of the cabin. We tried turning it off, but we had no luck, so we just left. When we got back to the trail, we were questioned by the other scouts and asked what was going on, if there was a baby down there. We told them that it was just this old creepy radio that we couldn't turn off. As creepy as it was, none of us really paid it any mind, especially since the one camping trip where an old woman was tweaking on drugs out in the woods, and we had to get the police involved. That creepy music kept playing and Mr. Dawson took us back down to the fork in the path and led us up the correct way to the cabin. The hike took a bit longer than we anticipated, but thankfully, the cabin was prepped for all of us, so all we had to do was unload our stuff and gather some firewood to start the dinner. The cabin was equipped with a fireplace stove, so we didn't have to build a fire circle and cook outside. This made us feel a false sense of security, especially after the incredibly odd situation that we had just encountered on the trail. It didn't take us long to gather all the firewood that we could possibly need for the trip, since there was a good number of us and we were all hungry. As we were gathering the firewood, the sun slowly began to creep behind the horizon, abandoning us to what horrors the night had to offer. We brought the firewood to the cabin, leaving most of it outside since it would have made a mess. Mr. Dawson was quick in starting the stove, and we were cooking in no time. The stove acted as a heat source for the cabin, which was nice, since the early autumn coolness was beginning to be more chilling in the evening. It took all of us a couple of minutes to be able to cook all of our food, due to the sheer amount of scouts and the limited size of the wood-burning stove. We made makeshift seats around the stove, and we enjoyed our meals as they came off the stove, one by one. As we were eating, we naturally began talking. We talked about events in our lives, school, sports, Bigfoot, whatever 12-year-olds talk about at that age. I can't remember who brought up the old radio. The atmosphere in the cabin went from a playful bliss to a more sobering, dreadful result. It wasn't so much the topic itself, but rather the theories surrounding the event. Why would a radio station be playing crying sounds? One of the scouts asked. I don't know of any station that just plays bizarre sounds. How was the radio even playing? It wasn't connected to a power source, and I didn't see it have batteries, another scout mentioned. Mr. Dawson, while cooking up his meal, mentioned that he had heard of things like this before, as a war tactic. Play a sound of someone in help, whether a comrade or a helpless child, and draw in the enemy into an unsafe area to ambush them. That explains why he walked around the old cabin with his gun out. We slowly shifted talking about theories of what could have been trapping us to scary stories. This was way before Creepypasta Wiki or horror channels on YouTube. The stories that we were sharing were either first-hand accounts of ghosts or cryptids out in the woods or abandoned buildings. We all took turns having the spotlight of telling scary stories when Mr. Dawson shared with us a truly terrifying story. It was when he was younger and helping his uncle move cattle across the open plains. He said it took them about a week or so to move all the cattle from one town to the other, where they would sell them in bulk. His job was to take a head count every night to keep track if they lost any cattle that day. If they lost any, then his uncle would go back and backtrack and try to find them during the night. All the cattle were equipped with very loud bells, which made finding them quite easy, but sleeping near them very difficult. On the first couple of days of the cattle drive, the company began to notice that at night, something would be disturbing the cattle into a small frenzy, causing everyone to be woken up by the commotion. After a quick investigation, they would find that one of the cows had been attacked by something with large claws and was still bleeding. The wound was so severe that the cow was bound to die, either from infection or blood loss, so they ended up putting it down. Mr. Dawson explained that he had never seen a wound like that before. His only thought was that it must have been a bear of some kind, but he had never seen or even heard of bears being in that area. He then explained that he found himself having a hard time trying to sleep outside, since he was exposed to whatever had injured that cow for the rest of the week. He had his theories on what he thought it could have been, but he wasn't for sure. The scout's eyes were wide and full of fear as the dim fire of the wood-burning stove began to slowly get lower. An unsettling silence fell on the group as they all considered the wide varieties of monsters and beasts that still could roam the open dark places of the world. Mr. Dawson then let out a shout to get the scouts to scream. The screams were shortly followed by laughter by both the scouts and the scoutmaster. The laughter eventually led to a silence as the scouts scoured their minds for the next scary story to share when they all began to hear a familiar tune, not too far off into the distance. The cabin provided a decent amount of soundproofing. However, the unnatural tune found its way slithering through the cracks and frame of the cabin, like some old venomous serpent coming to bring ill tidings. It took the group only but a moment before dread had struck them all in the gut. The sound that they were hearing was the same song on the radio that they had encountered earlier that day. "Wait here," Mr. Dawson said while standing up, unholstering his pistol again and opening the cabin door. He wasn't out there long before he came back in. The eerie tune crept off into the night, out of earshot, yet the bad feelings that had dragged here remained. All of our ears strained to hear more of the music, but it was gone. Out of earshot, yet the bad feelings that had dragged here remained. All of our ears strained to hear more of the music, but it was gone. At this point of the evening, we decided the best thing to do was to stock up on firewood, keep it near the stove, but most importantly, keep the cabin door closed. Mr. Dawson took the only available room to sleep in while the rest of the scouts spread out their sleeping bags around the dim but still warm wood-burning stove. The smooth crackling of the fire provided a calming effect to our young minds. However, the treacherous evil we had encountered earlier still dwelled in the shadows of uncertainty. No amount of security could make us feel safe while out in these woods, but the locked cabin door would have to do. Our nightly routine of inappropriate jokes was sidetracked, as none of us wanted to disturb the quiet air that kept us hidden inside the cabin. Despite the high anxiety and fear that we all were experiencing, the 5 miles we hiked up to this cabin had taken its toll on us. Much like the fire in the stove, our minds slowly dwindled into darkness, and we all found ourselves fast asleep. I don't remember falling asleep, but I do remember waking up. It felt as if I hadn't even fallen asleep in the first place. The first thing that I noticed, before anything else, was it. Standing in the nearest window, roughly 4 feet away from me, was a gaunt creature. At first I thought it was an old man, but it didn't take long before I realized that it wasn't. Its skin was gray and wrinkled like the bark of an old tree. Its eyes were sunken like dark pits that had no end. I couldn't see the eyes themselves, but I could feel their icy gaze violate me as it scanned its unholy sight upon me. For the brief moment that I was the only one awake, this creature and I shared a tormenting few seconds of silence and fear. I was paralyzed, but I could tell that this thing was delighted, that I was petrified. It seemed to feed off my fear like some kind of grotesque parasite, latching itself to the most vulnerable part of my soul. I thought this would be the most horrific thing I'd ever have to encounter in my life, but I was wrong. The hideous creature that was only separated by a thin paned window began to do something horrifying. The silence was broken by the familiar singing of that eerie tune from earlier. This creature was now singing it loudly, while also trying to do what I could only assume to be dancing. The creature moved rigidly, like its body was stiff from decay. Its dancing almost felt like a taunt, like it had me right where it wanted me, and there was nothing I could do to escape the inevitable doom that was sure to come. The singing caused me to break the trance of fear and allowed me to finally scream to alert everyone else. All the scouts slowly woke from their blissful dreams that granted them ignorance to the horrors that laid outside. It didn't take them long to see what I was screaming at, and they also followed in screams of terror. Mr. Dawson was a heavy sleeper. Even with the screams of the scouts and the creature singing quite loudly, he lay tucked away in the other room. 2 of the scouts were brave enough to open the door to the other room and wake the old scoutmaster, to hopefully rid us of this terror. Once awake, the scoutmaster knew almost instantly what was going on. He hopped out of bed while only wearing his evening apparel, which consisted of some socks, old faded boxers, and a white t-shirt. He grabbed his pistol and made his way for the door. Our screams then turned to shouts and pleads to stay inside, but the old man was determined to do what he wanted. He unlocked the door, and before he opened it all the way, the creature stopped singing and rushed the door with an unnatural bolt of speed and fury that I'd never seen before. The door flung open, hitting poor Mr. Dawson right in the face, causing him to fall violently. The fall probably did more damage than the door, as he let out a loud huff of pain when he landed. His face streamed blood quite quickly, which soon began to run onto his t-shirt. Despite the door hitting him and having the wind knocked out of him, Mr. Dawson was able to sit upright and aim his pistol at the creature, whose figure now stood in the doorway. His aim, despite the blood obscuring his sight, was rather on the mark, as the gunshots briefly illuminated the cabin with flashes of orange light coming from the pistol. Chunks of the creature blew off, but the bullets didn't seem to faze the creature. The creature's quick burst of speed quickly closed the gap between itself and Mr. Dawson. The next thing we all knew, the creature's nails gripped into his head much like someone were to palm a basketball and lifted him off the ground. Mr. Dawson let out screams of pain as the creature then lifted the screaming scoutmaster, and then began slamming him down head first into the wooden floor. Mr. Dawson sustained 2 powerful hits before his screams were silenced. The creature continued until the floor began to break under the high force of slams. Once lifeless, the creature then dragged Mr. Dawson out of the cabin and off into the woods. All of the scouts were either screaming or crying. Our only leader, who was responsible for keeping us safe, had been viciously slammed into a pulp effortlessly, all right before our eyes. One of the older scouts jumped up and slammed the door shut while locking it. All the other scouts began to place furniture around the door to provide a barricade to our only line of defense of that creature. The hour was late in the night, but there was no chance that any of us were going to find sleep after this gruesome event that just unfolded in front of our innocent minds. It took the troop around a good 30 minutes before we began to calm down. It didn't dawn on us right then, but we eventually realized that our way back to town was a 5-mile hike in the very forest in which this creature lived. If we were to ever make it back out of here, we would eventually have to take the chance and hike back. An hour later, just when we thought things were going to be calm, we heard the same chilling tune off in the distance. Much like before, the creature was also dancing, except this time it began to twirl something. It had 2 items in each of its hands. The closer the creature got, the better we were able to see that the creature was twirling the arms of the scout leader that had been ripped off his body. The scouts began to scream again as the creature danced around the cabin. The creature wasn't trying to get inside the cabin. It was just taunting us again. The creature eventually threw the arms at the cabin, making a loud thud, and danced its way back into the woods. The sun eventually made its way back into our lives, as we spent the longest night of our lives waiting for the creature to come back to eat us. Once the sun came out, the creature had yet to make an appearance. The scouts began to theorize about the creature. Maybe it doesn't like light. Why does it sing that song? Is that a demon of some kind? These were the ideas that we all shared with one another. We finally came to the conclusion that the creature was a demon of some kind, from a dark place, and that it didn't like light. That's why we hadn't seen it since the sun came up. We finally came up with a plan to get out of here. We were going to split up into 2 groups and hike back. If the creature were to get one group, then the other would have a chance to get away. As we were getting our plans all figured out, we saw someone come out of the woodline. With the events of last night, we had all forgotten about Mr. Carlson coming up today. Mr. Carlson came walking towards the cabin while carrying all his stuff when another figure appeared behind him. Mr. Carlson was about 30 yards away from the cabin and was in the middle of us and the other figure in the woods. We all began to scream for him to run to us as we tried unblocking the door, for all the furniture was still there. To our surprise, the figure behind Mr. Carlson was Mr. Dawson. For a brief moment, we were all very confused to what we were seeing. Did Mr. Dawson survive the attack from the creature? Mr. Carlson stopped as he turned around to see Mr. Dawson standing in the woodline. Our shouts must have been muffled by the cabin as he seemed to ignore us and walk over to Mr. Dawson. Once we were able to get the cabin door unblocked, we were finally able to yell at Mr. Carlson to tell him to run to us. In response, Mr. Dawson began to dance and sing much like the creature we encountered earlier. This wasn't Mr. Dawson. It was the creature imitating him. We all left the cabin and sprinted to Mr. Carlson to pull him inside, but the creature began to transform back into that hideous form. Mr. Carlson watched in horror as Mr. Dawson transformed into the most terrifying beast he had ever seen. Like before, the creature grabbed the head of Mr. Carlson and dragged him off into the woods, as Mr. Carlson screamed for his life. Some of us took the opportunity to run back into the trail and hopefully make it back, while others ran back to the cabin. My fear overtook my body as my mind instinctively ran on the trail leading back into town. The 5 miles went by quickly as my adrenaline carried me most of the way back. Once I reached the base of the trail, my adrenaline had been flushed from my body, as well as the handful of scouts that had followed me, and we collapsed in front of a family that was unloading a minivan for a hike. We were somehow able to find the strength to scream at them that our scout leaders were dead and that they should call the police. The police came and rounded up the scouts that made it back and questioned us about where the cabin was. We gave them the correct information and made their way off into the woods, while the paramedics took us to the hospital. The remaining scouts that stayed back in the cabin were found inside. All of them had been killed. The door had been broken down and their bodies thrown about. They had no leads on who or what had did this, and they ended up closing that part of the trail that led to the cabin. I haven't been back in those woods since. Not just those woods, but any woods in general. My warning goes out to those of you who might find themselves in the woods this time of year. If you hear crying, just turn back. Nothing good will happen if you investigate.
Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,